Hello, friends. I'm going to give you a homework assignment on this session of the Case for Life program. You may not like me for it, but I promise you this. If you do it, it will make you a sharp, clear, pro-life thinker within a matter of days. In fact, you may even be able to pull it off in a matter of hours if you devote time to it. What I want to do today is teach you how to categorize objections to the pro-life view. Because the mistake that so many pro-lifers make is they hear somebody make a claim about abortion and they immediately go into refutation mode. Well, how am I going to answer that? And you're thinking 10 miles ahead of the person you're talking to, and you're missing the point entirely. There is a better way. A way that allows you to just slow down, catch your breath, and think about things. So what is the assignment I'm going to give you? Well, here it is. I want you to grab one of these. This is just a file folder. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, how on earth is that going to help me be a better pro-life spokesperson? Well, the answer is you're going to use it to define objections. Now, I want you to notice something about this. You may be able to see this across the camera there, but across the top of the file folder, I have 4 categories of objections you get to the pro-life view. People who assume the unborn aren't human, people who attack pro-lifers rather than refute the argument, people who make assertions rather than argue, and those who misstate the facts. Okay. So what I do is I simply listen for what type of objection are they making and slot it into one of those categories. So I was on a website yesterday and I decided to try this out before I assigned it for you. And what I did is I went to a great pro-life website called Live Action. You've probably heard of Live Action. That's Lila Rose's organization. Great organization. They do a wonderful job training students and others to defend the pro-life view, and I've had the pleasure of working with them and will continue to work with them in the future. But I decided to go to one of their pages on social media where Live Action simply posted the scientific fact, really, that human life begins at conception. And they quoted an embryologist. They made the statement that human life begins when you join sperm and egg together and you get the emergence of a new living entity, the human zygote or embryo. Now, that is something you could learn and pick up from any embryology textbook anywhere in the world. So I wanted to read through the comments to see what were critics saying in response. And I went ahead and did that. So let's go ahead and just look at some of the things you will see on the Live Action page. So here I'm looking at one. It says, I know this is going to ruffle a lot of feathers, but having an abortion when you're not ready for children is one of the most responsible, least cruel choices you could make, end quote. Okay, so let's go look at our chart. Where do you think that objection goes? And if you said it assumes the unborn aren't human, you would be correct, because that's exactly what the objection does. Would it be compassionate to kill a 2-year-old because parents aren't ready for kids yet? Well, of course not. People would say, no, you can't do that. Well, why not? Well, because that 2-year-old, they would argue, is a human being. Well, wait a minute. If the embryos and fetuses in question are human beings, isn't it cruel to them to eliminate them because the parents claim they're not ready for kids yet? The pro-life argument is this couple already has a kid. The child in her womb is a living human being. It came from human parents. Human parents can only produce human offspring. So why would we think it's different than any other child outside the womb or in? And the answer is there is no difference. So what's happening here is, in this particular case, the critic is assuming the unborn aren't human. So I wrote that objection down here. I simply said not ready for children, and I plugged it in under that category. Now let's keep going and see what we get from this website. The next one was, don't talk to me about being pro-life. until you are ready to oppose war and adopt children you don't want aborted. Okay, so where would that one fit? Well, I think you can guess pretty clearly it comes under the attack category. This is somebody trying to attack the individual pro-lifer rather than refuting the pro-lifer's argument. So what ends up happening is the critic you're talking to can say all kinds of personal stuff about you. They could say you're ugly. Your father was a child molester. Your mother was a bank robber. And your Uncle Sam, well, he executed innocent people on train robberies back in the 19th century. I don't know, whatever they come up with, it doesn't matter. Here's the key point. Even if the attack were true, it does not refute your pro-life argument that it's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings. Abortion does that, therefore it's wrong. So I'm going to slot that objection right under the attack category right here and write it down. And all I did is put down on the paper here, pro-life when you adopt or oppose war. Okay, that's enough to trigger my memory about what the objection was. Now, the next objection we get here is also very interesting. It says the fetus, or the zygote, as this commentator puts it, is not a living human until it has a heartbeat. Okay, well, this is an example of somebody making an assertion. Is there any biological evidence that there's no human life until we have a heartbeat? No, this is somebody simply asserting something. I could assert the moon is made of green cheese. Yeah, I can say it, but it doesn't mean I've made a case for it. And what's happening here is the person is not making an argument. And typically what happens with pro-lifers, we go right into refutation mode. Well, that's not true. We know from the science of embryology, the unborn are distinct, living, and whole human beings. Correct. But what I would do when I was engaging that person, I would say this. Tell me, how did you come to the conclusion that there's no human being until there is a heartbeat? And I would put the burden of proof on them to defend their own claim. It's not on me to defend my position because I haven't made a claim there. They're the ones who made the claim. So the same would apply if they said something like, well, women have a right to choose. Choose what? And where did that right to choose come from? And why is that right to choice ethical? Choose what? Well, obviously what they're choosing here is the ending of a human life in the womb. Well, then why should that be ethically permissible? They need to answer these questions. They love to hide behind the terms that they simply throw out there as assertions like choice or heartbeat is what gives us our right to life, whatever they pick. It's an assertion, and you're always within your rights to say, why would you believe a thing like that? Or how did you come to that conclusion where you're asking for evidence? That's an important thing to do. Now, another way that people argue here is they misstate the facts. So looking back at this screenshot here, I see a person saying that if we have cells that are alive, they're no different than embryos that are alive. The writer here says, look, every cell in your body is alive. Does that mean those cells are individual human beings with a right to life? Okay, this is a misstatement of the scientific facts. So what I'm going to do here is correct it, and I'll slot the objection into that category. Now, how would you respond to somebody who says something like this? Well, when somebody says that every cell in your body is alive, therefore, there's no difference between an embryo and cells, for example, on the back of my hand. They are confusing parts with wholes. These cells on the back of my hand, for example, or every other somatic cell in my body, is simply part of a larger human being, me. They are not distinct whole human beings the way you were as an embryo, the way I was as an embryo. In other words, there's a difference in kind between each of our bodily cells, which are parts, and the distinct whole living human being you were at the embryonic stage, even though you had yet to grow and develop. If you take a somatic cell from the back of my hand and throw it into the womb of a woman, you're not going to get a child emerging 9 months later. that cell is not going to ever become anything but a somatic cell unless you were able to act on it externally through some kind of cloning process, which isn't necessary for the child developing naturally and directing its own internal development in the womb. So I'm going to make note of that misstatement of fact. It'd help if I get my thing the right side up here, and I'm going to write it down. Now, another objection I noted here is the person said that embryo is not a baby. So I wrote that down under, again, misstatements. And you know what? There's a hidden premise here that isn't being exposed, and I'm going to expose it right now. The hidden premise is this, that in order to have a right to life, you have to be, quote, a baby. Well, that's really not the essence of the pro-life argument. The essence of the pro-life argument is that it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being, regardless his or her stage of development, whether that's a zygote, an embryo, a fetus, a newborn, a child born prematurely at say 24 weeks instead of 40 weeks, or a toddler, or a teenager for that matter. So the real issue here is not, is this a baby, which is simply describing a stage of development that we all go through. Rather, the question is, does abortion intentionally kill an innocent human being, regardless his or her stage of development? And so by raising this objection that it's not yet a baby, you haven't refuted the pro-life argument. You've simply tried to appeal to an earlier stage of development and say, see, it's not this later stage, therefore it's okay to kill the child in the womb. But you haven't presented an argument for why intentionally killing an innocent human being at that earlier stage is morally permissible. You've simply called the unborn entity a name that you think then can dehumanize it enough to say it's okay to proceed killing whatever that thing is. Well, that's not going to work because all of these stages, fetus, newborn, teenager, adult, senior citizen, are simply descriptions of stages of development of the same human being through the course of his or her existence. Now, there is a fifth way people argue, and I've written that down on the back page here, and that is they hide behind the hard cases. So, for example, I'm looking at this back to this page here where people are objecting to the claim that the fetus is human from conception, and they're making their rebuttals. This one says, well, a woman who is pregnant and has an ectopic pregnancy won't be able to get medical services to save her own life if you pro-lifers get your way. Okay, let's go ahead and take that objection at face value. Suppose that were true. It's not, and I'll show you why in a minute, but suppose it were true. How would that refute the pro-life argument that from the earliest stages of development, you've got a distinct, living, and whole human being? And the answer is it would not. All it would do is suggest that there are some undesirable consequences to the pro-life argument, but you wouldn't have refuted the pro-life argument. Now, the reason I wrote this down in part was to say what I just said, but I also want to make the claim that there's no state law on the books anywhere, and I've looked at them, that says that if a woman needs a life-saving procedure while pregnant that involves ending the pregnancy, she cannot get that procedure. That is not in the language anywhere. In fact, all these state laws protecting the unborn are very good at making a distinction between abortion, which they define as the intentional killing of the fetus, versus emergency medical treatment that is needed to save the mother's life. They do not treat medical intervention the same as the intentional killing of an innocent human being. And they have good reason for that. They rightly recognize that in the case of treating the mother for a health risk, we recognize that though we foresee the death of the unborn, we don't intend it. If we had a way to save the mother and the child both, we would do it. But there are some cases where we can't do that. Therefore, we save the one life we can, that of the mother. That is not the same as abortion. And again, this is why it's so important to define our terms in a syllogism. It is wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. That's our first premise. Notice the beauty of that. We're defining our terms so that when people come along and try to change the kind of argument we're making, we can stop them. Then our second premise, of course, is abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. Conclusion, therefore, abortion is wrong. So when they're throwing stuff at you, you can ask yourself, does this refute my syllogism that it's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings? Abortion does that, therefore it's wrong. And the beauty of plugging their objections into these categories, you don't have to memorize every single objection you might get. You can just plug their objection into these categories and you can begin to make sense of it. So here's your homework assignment. I want you to get one of these, a file folder. If you don't have one, go to your local Walmart and buy a pack of them. It'll cost you about $3. All right. I think I paid $3.99 for a pack of 40 of them. I don't know, but I got a whole bunch of them sitting here. And all you do is make the categories. The first category will be assume. The second category will be attack. The next category will be assert. And the next category will be misstate the facts. And I want you to begin with just those 4 categories and take a couple of days and just pull open your social media accounts and go to posts where people are talking about abortion and just read through the comments and see if you can't plug in the objection to these categories. And if you train your mind to do this, what happens is you'll do it on autopilot as you begin talking with people down the road. So I cannot stress enough the importance of repetitious learning. It is important to practice how you're going to respond to people, because then you don't have to sit there scratching your head going, oh, how am I going to respond to this one? You already know how you're going to approach responding to that objection because you've practiced with these categories. Then what I'd like you to do is I want you to do the exercise again, but come back and look for hard case objections. Now, here's something to keep in mind about hard case objections. They never justify abortion for the reason your critic wants to justify abortion. So, for example, I've been in debates, I've been in conversations with people, well, they'll say things like this. Well, what about a woman who's been raped? You're going to force her to bring this child to term? That's so cruel. All right, I know almost for certain that the person I'm talking to does not believe that abortion should only be legal in cases of rape. He or she believes it should be legal and available for any reason the woman wants, no questions asked. So I'm going to call his or her bluff. I will simply say, okay, let's grant for the sake of argument that we allow abortion in cases of rape. Will you join me in opposing all other abortions that have nothing to do with a hard case like rape? I mean, really what's going on here is exactly what my friend Frank Beckwith points out. People want to justify all abortions by appealing to a rare case where a woman's been assaulted. And Frank makes a great observation. He says, this is kind of like someone arguing we should get rid of all traffic laws because you might have to run a red light rushing a loved one to the hospital. Their real position is that abortion should be legal for any reason. They're trying to hide behind the hard cases to avoid defending what their real position is, which any rational person would find extreme. Abortion for any reason through all 9 months of pregnancy? Try defending that rather than hiding behind a victim of sexual assault. So again, these 5 areas here, assume, attack, assert, misstatement of fact, and hard cases. Go on social media, have a little fun with this. Just read through the comments. Don't get angry. Just plug in the comments into these 5 categories, and you'll begin training your mind to think very clearly on how you can respond to these things. Remember, in the first case, when people assume the unborn are not human, You can always ask yourself, would this work as a good argument for killing a toddler? If not, you know the argument is assuming the unborn aren't human. That's a fallacy we call begging the question. Nobody argues for choice, trusting parents to make their own decisions, or privacy rights if we're talking about killing 5-year-olds, right? They only argue that way with fetuses, but that assumes the unborn aren't human. No presidential candidate or other politician is going to say reproductive freedom is good for everyone if they were talking about killing a newborn even. Most people today would oppose that. Notice, though, when we talk about reproductive freedom being good for, quote, everyone, unquote, we're leaving someone out. Is it good for the unborn who get destroyed in the process of exercising one's so-called right to reproductive freedom? Then, of course, you got the attack category. When people attack you, please do not get angry. Instead, I want you to pivot. I want you to ask this question. If this attack were true, and usually it's not, when people say, for example, well, pro-lifers just hate women, that's not true. Or pro-lifers don't give a rip about kids once they're born. That's not true, but bear with me for a moment. Even if we said it was true, let's grant those attacks are true. We hate women and we don't give a rip about kids once they are born. How does that refute our argument that it's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings? Abortion does that, therefore it's wrong. All we're ending up here with is the ad hominem fallacy of attacking the person rather than the argument they're making. Look, my alleged unwillingness to adopt a child does not justify an abortionist killing one. If I came to you and said, look, unless you agree to adopt my 3 sons by noon tomorrow, I shall execute them. Now, that's not going to happen because my kids are grown and they're bigger than me now, but play along for a moment. If you turn down my ultimatum, am I justified intentionally killing my kids? The answer is no. My right to kill a child does not turn on whether or not you agree to adopt them. I don't have a right to intentionally kill an innocent human being simply because other people won't meet my demands. That's not a good way to reason. And then you also want to listen for people who just want to make assertions. And you are always within your right to ask, how did you come to believe a thing like that? Or how did you come to that conclusion? This is something that's just good to do no matter your context. I'll give you a bit of a personal example. Tonight, I'm going to a meeting at my church. There's come up an issue in the church that is quite contentious, and there are people with very strong opinions on both sides. And I'm going to go to that meeting tonight, and I'm going to be very neutral in the sense that I'm going to listen to what both sides have to say, but I'm going to be prepared to ask some questions that are going to go along the lines of this. What do you mean by that term? And whatever term comes up in the discussion, I'll ask for a clarification. Then I will ask, how did you come to the conclusion that X, Y, or Z was true? And I'm going to ask for their evidence. That is perfectly acceptable for people who want to think clearly to ask for those kinds of questions. So when I get people who assert things like, well, you don't have a living human being until there's a heartbeat or till it emerges from the womb, I'm going to ask how they came to that conclusion. What evidence can they present to get to that conclusion that they're asserting? In this way, we keep the discussion on the facts, on the arguments, rather than personalizing everything. Then, of course, I'm going to listen for misstatement of facts, things I know to be false that I can then slot into that category and come back and correct it in the proper place in the discussion. And finally, I'll listen for people who are hiding behind the hard cases. And by doing this, by developing your mind to think in these categories, you can simplify objections and you can come into a discussion confident that you'll have something persuasive to say. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to mention something that is very prevalent in the news right now. We have just learned that under the Biden administration, pro-lifers were specifically targeted by the U.S. Justice Department to be prosecuted under the FACE Act and other federal laws, and that the Biden administration relied on the testimony of abortion advocacy groups to pinpoint who would be prosecuted. And one pro-lifer just won an amazing amount of money in a lawsuit against the Department of Justice for what was done during the Biden years. I'll say a few words about that when we come back from the break. Hello, friends. You may not have time to read a full-length treatment of abortion like I've done in this book, The Case for Life, the second edition, but you may have time to take what amounts to 7 sessions, a week's worth of study if you want to do it day by day, to learn how to defend your pro-life views persuasively. We have a basic course that will help you do just that. You will learn how to make a formal case for the pro-life position. You will learn how to defend it with science and philosophy. Even with non-Christians, you can make a case for the pro-life view. Then we'll teach you how to handle objections, how to recognize the 5 bad ways people argue about abortion, and how they often bring up things that are beside the point. You'll learn to keep the main thing, so that you're in charge instead of feeling like you're in the hot seat whenever the issue of abortion comes up. Visit the website for details. Welcome back, everybody. Listen, there was some good news yesterday if you're a pro-lifer. A pro-life advocate who, under the Biden administration, had been jailed, prosecuted, falsely, I might add, because what was happening is the Biden administration was creating a list of people, really an enemies of the state list, if you want to get right down to it, whose crime was they advocated for the pro-life cause. That was their crime. They were being prosecuted for the content of what they believed and expressed. And so rather than respecting free speech, the Biden administration and the Democrats prosecuted these guys and gals. And there's a whole list of them that were subject to this. But what happened yesterday is one of the gentlemen who was prosecuted unfairly won a huge lawsuit against the Department of Justice, and he's going to be well off for the rest of his life. And you know what? I'm glad for him. But I want you to think about this. There's a lot of people out there who say it doesn't matter whether you've got a Republican or Democrat in the White House, nothing changes on abortion. Excuse me, I don't know of any Republican administration that prosecuted pro-lifers simply because they believed what they believed. That happens under Democrat administration, sadly, but not under Republicans. I'm glad for this verdict, but it does give us a warning. We need to be careful about how we vote. Thanks for joining us today. Glad to have you.